Welcome to the Manipulation Check with Dr. Jeff Spence and Dr. Dan Smilek. They are just two academics with PhDs in psychology trying to make sense of the world. Come and listen to the conversation.
Here we are, the inaugural Manipulation Check podcast.
That's right.
So,
this is our first episode of what we hope to be an ongoing podcast, and we've chosen the name The Manipulation Check. And multiple meanings, and maybe we'll explain that as we go through other episodes. Now, our goal, I think, is to apply scientific ideas and principles to everyday life so that we can better understand the events that are going on in the world, the events, the madness around us, so to speak.
The unraveling, maybe, that's occurring right now. And Jeff, why don't you lead us in here? Because I know you have a question that you want to pose that we want to answer today. Sure. So we've been, watching the world unravel for, how long has it been now? 20 months or so?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So we did what any two sane people would do. We decided to start a podcast.
That's right.
What better thing to do?
Yeah.
But so something we've been talking about between the two of us is sort of the pandemic and the pandemic response. And we're hearing a lot from vaccinologists, immunologists, physicians. A group we're not hearing from, with the exception of, I would say, Matthias Desmet, clinical psychologist,
yes,
is psychologists or people with some kind of expertise in psychology. And it would seem to us, from our conversations anyways, that psychology has a lot to offer and a lot to say about what's happening, and could be quite useful in terms of helping people understand what's happening, give some kind of vocabulary to, digest and understand what's happening, as well as some frameworks, and maybe even, I dare say, point to some solutions to maybe improve our situation.
That's our goal, right? Yeah, that's our goal, is to get to some solutions, to have an understanding, and then to provide some solutions, ways to move forward.
Right. Yeah. So we'll try and be useful. Lofty goal, especially for academics, perhaps, right?
Yeah.
So we'll try not to be too academic with this. But the first topic, the most pressing question, I think that we have is the mandates and the passports, and everything they represent. And then, so beyond that, what we're seeing is basically pretty widespread segregation and discrimination. So it's almost too much to cover off all the different examples and instances, because it's happening worldwide. Depending on where you are, you're experiencing very different things, perhaps.
And Jeff, you're talking about the vaccine mandates here, right? This idea that people have to be vaccinated. And so there's been this divide between those who are vaccinated and those who are not vaccinated, or maybe even those who don't declare their status initially.
True. Yeah. Yeah. So what we're seeing is people have been fired from their jobs, put on suspensions, unpaid leaves. We're seeing students unenrolled from courses, people being barred from restaurants, gyms, meeting places. We're even seeing stories of people not being able to get life-saving organ transplants because of their status or their lack of vaccine paperwork. We're even getting news from Austria, places like Austria, where it's looking like at some point in 2022, there's going to be compulsory fines for not being vaccinated. And then if the fines aren't paid, there's threats of prison time.
Wow.
So quite the situation. Definitely something I don't think I would have thought I would have lived to see.
Yeah.
But what we're seeing is, not only are we seeing these, this segregation and, arguably discrimination, but we're also seeing is general acceptance of these policies and practices. So you're seeing some demonstrations, some protests, but generally speaking, has not been much pushback.
So that's interesting, right? Because it depends on what media you watch. So
Right.
if you're on the social media, you're seeing huge protests all over the world, but it's just not being carried by the mainstream media. So it seems like there's a lot of silence. So it's kind of it's almost like bipolar or something, right? Or not yeah. Maybe multiple personality disorder more so.
Definitely disordered, yeah.
Yeah, definitely disordered, yeah.
Yeah, so you're seeing these pockets of, definite acceptance or indifference. And then on the extreme of that, we're even seeing championing of these ideas and calls for doing more and justifications that they're okay and it's actually reasonable and right to do these things.
Yeah. And we see family members too, who are ostracizing their other family members. So you have, vaccinated, let's say grandparents and parents, and they won't let the unvaccinated youngster into their midst, right? At holidays and so on. And of course we have the leadership within various countries is actually suggesting don't get together with family that are unvaccinated. So yeah, there seems to be a widespread divide there. It's almost like there's this othering of the people who are unvaccinated, and it just seems to know no bounds at this point. So it's good to address this, I think.
Yeah. So one of the questions we're faced with here, the two of us, is how is this possible? The other is is this kind of an inexplicable phenomenon?
Yeah,
because a lot of times we're sitting there watching what's happening, and it's really difficult to digest the scope and the scale and the general magnitude of it. So, is this something that's actually explicable, or is it something that's completely inexplicable that we just have no idea? We're at a loss for how to explain what's going on, and I think this is where psychology comes in. Is that psychology? From our discussions and what we're going to cover today, has some very clear, let's say, mechanisms and possibilities to explain, what's happening. So what seems like something that's quite inexplicable, just by applying some basic psychological principles, it can become potentially quite explicable to the current situation.
Yeah, and there are a lot of different psychological principles that I think apply. So we can't cover them all, obviously, in this first episode, because I think we want to drill down on some of them, right? And so one that I've been sort of taking a deep dive into the classic experiments of Milgram, Stanley Milgram. And a lot of people probably know a little bit about those experiments from maybe even a high school course, but maybe Psychology 101. And then I know you've been digging into the in-group, out-group literature. And so we want to cover that too. But of course, we're right from the start, we want to say there are other principles at play, and we hope to cover those maybe in future episodes, should those appear.
Yeah, so these aren't exhaustive. Sorry to cut you off. These aren't exhaustive. And also, these aren't esoteric ideas or findings or principles. These are quite, I'll call them mainstream or foundational. It's something that anybody with, let's say, a degree in psychology would have probably covered it in some, if not multiple, courses. So this isn't secret. This isn't secret knowledge that we're uncovering. It's very much out there in the open, and even classifiable as probably everybody knows this.
Yes,
everybody in psychology would know this already.
Yeah, and we just want to dig a little bit deeper and then apply it to the current situation, apply these principles to the current situation. And I think the other point we want to make is that, especially when it gets into these dynamics where you effectively have an oppressor who is oppressing somebody else, there's obviously some valence that can be applied to that, right? Oppression is bad and so on. But we want to make the case that these principles actually apply to all of us, right? That all of us have the potential to be, and probably have been in our lifetime, in the role of an oppressor or a discriminator, right? And maybe also in the role of the victim of these sorts of things. So these are just general principles. So we're not trying to point the finger at somebody and say, hey, you're bad. That's not the goal here. We just want to explain the dynamics that are unfolding. Does that make sense, Jeff? Do you agree?
That does, yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
These aren't limited to just the mandate and passport situation.
Yeah, that's right.
They're applicable to a wide range of scenarios, as you pointed out.
Okay, so let's jump right into Milgram and talk about his experiments and try to apply some of his principles, and then maybe you could pepper in the in-group, out-group stuff, or we can leave that for another episode or for later on in this episode. We'll see how that goes.
See how it goes, yeah.
Yeah, so when I was digging into Milgram, I read some of his original work. So he's got a great paper that was published in 1963. And I also read his book, and here's his book. If I can show it on the camera here, look at all my my markings. I went through this very carefully. And there's also an original documentary that I think Milgram put together, and you can find it on YouTube. And I was really surprised, Jeff, to find that Milgram is actually an excellent writer. I mean, this guy, his writing is so lucid. He's so clear. There's no wasted words. And he really gets to the point. And he was very insightful, maybe even at times philosophical. And I think he actually put together the original documentary. So he was a cinematographer. And one of the papers I read even said that one of the reasons his work is so popular is because he was so good at promoting it with video and in his writing. So
he's got books, he's got videos. So what time frame are we dealing with here? What are the...
Yeah, so this would have been the early 1960s. So his first paper, I think, was 1963. The experiments were 1960 to 1963. And then his book came out in 1974, which I believe, his wife actually helped him write as well. And by the way, Jeff, when I was looking for the documentary on YouTube, one of the items that came up, one of the videos that came up was this sort of shorter version of the methodology that was used in the Milgram studies. And it's put out by some guy, and the description had the following. It had PSA, which I think means public service announcement. Quote, if you watch this and somehow think that this exemplifies COVID restrictions, mandates, and vaccines, you've entirely missed the point of the study.
So we should stop then.
We should stop. Not allowed to think of Milgram in the context of the vaccine mandates.
Not allowed. Says an authority figure, perhaps.
We're going to be canceled, Jeff, just for talking about this. We're out of bounds. That guy.
Maybe we're canceled before we even get started. He came out and was saying, just so you know.
Yeah. Okay,
don't even think about it.
That's right. So Milgram set out to study obedience to authority, and he opens this seminal paper that he wrote that appeared in 1963, and it was in the Journal of Abnormal and Social Psychology. He opens it this way, quote, obedience is as basic an element in the structure of social life as one can point to. Some system of authority is a requirement of all communal living, and it is only the man dwelling in isolation who's not forced to respond through defiance or submission to the commands of others. And then he goes on, and he says, facts of recent history and observations in daily life suggest that for many persons, obedience may be a deeply ingrained behavior tendency, indeed a prepotent impulse overriding training in ethics, sympathy, and moral conduct, end quote. The issue here is that obedience to authority pervades our social lives. It's a necessary component of communal living. You got to either be a hermit living out in the woods, and then you might not have to worry so much about obedience. But as long as you have other people around you, you've got a system, you're going to be stuck in an authority obedience kind of structure. But Milgram was especially interested in obedience to authority when that obedience meant that the person goes against his or her conscience and even causes harm to somebody else. And so to study this kind of obedience, Milgram set up what he called an authority system, which includes an authority, an executant, and I like that word.
Great word.
Yeah, and a victim. And the authority essentially issues a command to the executant, and that command requires the executant to punish the victim in some way. And Milgram's basic question was, and here I'd be kind of paraphrasing Milgram, if the authority tells the executant to hurt the victim, Under what conditions will the executant carry out the command of the authority, and under what conditions will the executant refuse to carry out that command? That's the basic question that he had. Now, to study this type of obedience, Milgram brought participants into the laboratory under the auspice of participating in a learning experiment. And he basically just drew people. He put an ad in the paper, and he drew people from the community, and they were businessmen, laborers, nurses, and he recruited to come into a lab at Yale University. And once they arrived in the lab, so you think about it, this is a prestigious institution, okay? And once they arrived in the lab, they met another individual who they believed was also a participant. But in fact, this individual was a collaborator, an actor. And they also met the
sorry to cut you off. These are all grown-ups, so to speak, all mature individuals, lives, jobs, families, the whole deal, a lot of responsibilities. Not children, undergrad students.
Not undergraduate students, that's right. These were people from the community, just regular people. Regular Joes like you and me, Jeff.
Just a couple guys.
Just a couple guys, that's right. And yeah, they met the experimenter as well, and the experimenter wore a white lab coat, so he looked very official. And then he delivered a cover story to the two individuals, so the actual participant and the Confederate. And the cover story is that they were studying how punishment influences learning, and they had this whole story about how research in psychology, doesn't really know how punishment works, and so that's what they're going to do. And in order to do this, in order to study this, one of them has to take the role of a teacher, one of them has to take the role of a learner, and they drew lots to determine who was going to play what role. And of course, the teacher was going to be the one who was dishing out the punishment. And in this case, by the way, he used an electric shock being applied to the learner. Okay, so the teacher was going to administer the shock to the learner, and that was the punishment. And then the learner was going to be, trying to learn things, and then whenever they made a mistake, they would get the shock. Okay, that was the idea. But of course, the draw was rigged so that the actual participant always became the teacher. That person always had to deliver the punishment, and then the Confederate became the learner. So
what's a Confederate?
So right, that's a good question. People might not know that. So yeah, Confederate is somebody who's working with the experimenter. So they're on the team with the experiment. They know what's going on, but they're acting. They're playing a role that the actual participant doesn't, and the actual participant doesn't know that they're playing that role. Okay, so they believe that this quote unquote Confederate is a real person, just like they are, that has randomly come into the laboratory. Yeah?
Yeah.
Hey, I got a video for you.
All right.
So this is a little clip from the actual study from one of Milgram's, from his documentary. Let's see if I can load it up here.
While it's loading up, I'll just draw attention to something that's going to be, I think, applicable to the in-group, out-group that we might discuss later, is the labels that were used.
Okay. And
there's very clear categorization that was being used, namely being called the teacher and then being called the learner or the student.
Yes, that's right. So in that sense, you're putting people into two separate groups.
There's groups,
right?
Yeah. There's individuals, but those individuals belong to these higher order categories.
Yeah, and there's already, I guess, there are already stereotyped views about those two groups, right? Like the teacher is sort of has higher status than the learner and so on.
Right.
Okay. So here, let's see if this works.
Therefore, I'm going to ask one of you to be the teacher here this afternoon, and the other to be the learner. And the way we usually decide is to let you draw from these two pieces of paper on which I've written the two positions. If this is agreeable with both of you, we can do it that way. If you take one, please. You know the other. Would you open those and tell me which of you is which, please? Teacher. Learner. Teacher. All right, now the next thing we'll have to do is set the learner up so that he can get some sort of punishment. Now what I'm going to do is strap down your arms to avoid any excessive movement on your part during the experiment. Is that too tight? That's all. Okay. This electrode is connected to the shock generator in the next room. All right, now let me explain to you, learner, exactly what's going to happen and what you're supposed to do. The teacher will read a list of word pairs to you like these. Blue girl, nice day, fat neck, and so forth. You are to try to remember each pair. For the next time through, the teacher will read only the first word or the first half of the word pair. For example, he will say blue. And then he'll read 4 other words, such as boy, girl, grass, hat. Now your job is to remember which one of these 4 other words was originally paired with blue. And you indicate your answer by pressing one of these 4 switches. Now can you reach those all right? Now if you get it correct, fine. If you make an error, however, you'll be punished with an electric shock. So of course it is to your advantage that you learn all these word pairs as quickly as possible.
I think so.
Do you have any questions now before we go into the next room?
No, but I think I should say this. About 2 years ago, I was at the Veterans Hospital in West Haven.
Mm-hmm.
And while there, they detected a heart condition. There's nothing serious, but as long as I'm having these shocks, how strong are they? How dangerous are they?
Well, no, although they may be painful, they're not dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else?
No, that's all.
All right, teacher, would you take the test and be seated in front of the shock generator, please, in the next room?
That was very important, by the way. So that was the Confederate. Now, this here shows a shock generator. Notice it goes from about 15 to 450 volts in 15-volt increments. And there are labels there, and it goes from slight shock to extreme intense shock, danger, severe shock. Right there, danger, severe shock, and then XXX up by the 450-volt mark, right? So very
All
dangerous.
subjects are given identical instructions and a sample shock.
Now, after you've read the 4 choices, the learner pushes one of the switches on the board in front of him, and the number he has selected will light up in this box, 1, 2, 3, or 4. Now, if he gives the correct answer, you say correct and go on to the next line. The correct answer is underlined and is also indicated in the right margin.
Yeah.
If he were to indicate the wrong answer, you would say wrong. Then tell him the number of volts you're going to give him. Then give him the punishment.
So that was a clip from the documentary. What did you think there, Jeff?
Something that really jumps out at me in seeing it. I've seen it a few times, but this time in particular, what jumps out at me is the caring that's demonstrated by the experimenter.
Yeah.
In putting the person in the chair, making sure they're comfortable. Can you reach it okay? So they're not this cold, at least at the outset anyways, they're not this cold-hearted, authoritarian, sort of classically stereotypical, sadist who's just there looking to punish people. There's a lot of care and humanity demonstrated by the experimenter.
Yes.
And I don't know if that was intentional or not, or if it was just the actor playing the experimenter that really embodied that role. But it really, the care and how methodical the instructions were is really something I think that is worth pointing out.
Yeah, and another important point is that the teacher was looking on, and they saw the learner, who of course was the Confederate, being strapped in and talking about the shock, being told about the shock, and then also saying that he had a heart condition. Okay, and that's a very important detail, and they included that in some later experiments because as the experiment unfolds, what happens is that the victim, the learner, starts to protest, right? And the fact that he's got a heart condition, you're delivering electric shocks, that gives more context to the whole thing. But now just sort of returning back to the overall framing, this authority system that Milgram talked about, you can think of the authority here as being the experimenter, the executant as being the teacher, and of course the victim would be the learner. And so let's think about this for a second here, Jeff. How does that apply to the current vaccine mandates? Who would fall into these different roles with the vaccine mandates?
Who goes where?
Yeah. What do you think?
Well,
who's the authority?
The authority here, I would say, is, quote, science and scientific consensus.
Yeah, that's right. And we... Mm-hmm.
Yeah, go ahead.
We would add probably public health.
Yeah, and then from there, you get, any number of figures. And this is one of the things I think it makes it kind of interesting and somewhat more complicated, is you could have any number of authorities. So you can point to any number of individuals, let's say, or institutions. It's somewhat harder, I think, to point to specific individuals.
Yeah.
But you would have individuals that would be representing the authority. So in that case, you'd have maybe specific individuals like public health officials or politicians, or maybe managers, administrators, business leaders who would be administrating the system.
Yeah, right. So you can think of it like a hierarchy, right? So that there's like at the top of the hierarchy, and then you have, different authority figures down the hierarchy. But let's say at the top there, I think I would probably say public health would be the big one. Government authorities might also be up there. And of course, they're working under the auspice of science. Okay, what about the executant?
Now we're getting into, now you'd be getting into, if we're talking about the mandates, talking about the
mandates,
we'll I guess keep it to the mandates for now. I think you're dealing with managers, you're dealing with administrators, you're dealing with the ones who are carrying out, let's say, the commands of the authority. Yeah.
So they're the enforcers as well, right? I like the word executant because you're executing the order.
You're exactly, And then you could even extend it to basically anybody who's in a position where they have to carry out, the order. So you could even be talking about people who work in service industries, where you're having to, let's say, enforce the passport, for example, of admittance to restaurants, meeting places, gyms, etc.
Police services.
Police, absolutely. Yeah. Anybody who's
security
in the
personnel.
Bylaw officers.
Yeah. Okay. What about the victim? That's kind of straightforward, right?
Yeah, I think that's it's anybody who's on the receiving end of, or has been on the receiving end of the policies.
Yeah, and typically I think that would be the unvaccinated, or we could say the vaccine-free, but also maybe those who are not declaring their status.
Yeah.
Right? So they just refuse to declare their status, and now they can bar entry, or they're being barred entry into something. Or people, for instance, who have been maybe double vaccinated or triple vaccinated soon, and they don't want to show their passports. Right, so there'd be kind of like that's non-declaring in very particular contexts, right?
That's a really good point of distinction. It's not the status itself; it's the outward appearance or representation of the status.
Indeed, yeah. But presumably, it's a lot of those people might be unvaccinated. Okay, so we clearly see here how the Milgram authority structure maps onto the current mandates. So let's talk a little bit about what actually happened to the participants. How did they respond? Did they actually shock their learners? Did they go to the max voltage? And so I have a few clips here, Jeff, for us. So let me just show you these clips and then we can talk about them. So, okay, first clip here. Here we go.
Answer, please. Wrong. I'm up to 180 volts.
Please continue, teacher.
Neil, you're going to get a shock. 180 volts.
Ow! I can't stand the pain. Let me out of here.
Can't stand it. I'm not going to kill that man there. You hear him hollering?
As I said before, the shocks may be painful, but they're not dangerous.
They're hollering. He can't stand it. What if something happens to him?
The experiment requires that you continue, teacher.
Yeah, but I'm not going to get that man sick in there. I mean, he's hollering in there. You know what I mean?
Whether the learner likes it or not, we must go on until he's learned all the word pairs.
I refuse to take the responsibility of getting hurt in there. He's in there hollering.
It's absolutely essential that you continue, teacher.
There's too many left here, and geez, he gets wrong here. There's too many of them left. I mean, who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?
I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please.
All right, next one, slow. Walk.
So you notice he continues. What do you think, Jeff?
He said the magic word.
Which is what?
Or words, assuming responsibility.
Ah, that's right. That's one key point. That's right. And we heard there, and I hope our listeners did as well, the learner calling out in pain and protesting and asking for the teacher to stop, right? And I don't think that happened. That happened in some of the later. I'm not sure that happened in the first experiment that they did. That it was so audible, right? But in this experiment, yeah, he says, "I can't take the pain. Let me out of here." Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any other thoughts about that clip?
That's fascinating. The extent to which the individual, let's say the executant, is uncomfortable with what's happening. So there's no confusion. There's no ambiguity in that particular instance, anyways, with what's happening and where that individual is and how uncomfortable that individual is with carrying out the instructions.
Yeah,
and they themselves are protesting
mm-hmm.
the let's say the policies or the procedures. And the refrain from the experimenter is you must continue. It's really important that you continue. You must do this thing. And then similarly, just like the participant, or let's say in this case, I'll try and get it right. The learner is protesting with no effect because they keep getting shocked. He keeps getting shocked and shocked and shocked. Similarly, the teacher is protesting, saying, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this. This isn't right. I'm not comfortable with this. And similarly, having no effect at changing the scenario, changing the situation.
Yeah. All it takes, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Yeah. All it takes are some prompts from the experimenter, right? And then the individual moves on. And by the way, I have from the paper here. So here's the paper. They list the prod. So they were predetermined. The Milgram calls these prods. I call them prompts. But here's what the experimenter could say. Please continue, or please go on. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. And the fourth prod is, you have no other choice. You must go on.
Very clear, very direct. No ambiguity there, but also hollow statements.
Yes. The person could just say, well, I don't care. Like, why must I go on?
Right.
But they don't. They just they ask a few questions, but then they just keep going. I have another clip here. So this is the same guy, and now he's getting near the end of the experiment where he's getting up to the 400 volt level. Remember, the max here is 450.
Gold, dollar, necklace, moon, paint. Answer, please. Are you all right? 405 volts. The answer is moon. Next one, heart, stone, head, bread, work. Answer, please.
No answer.
The answer is head, 420 volts. Next one, wet, night, grass, duck, cloth. The answer is duck.
There's no answer.
435 volts. It says danger, severe shock here. Next X on the next one.
Continue, please.
435 volts.
And he keeps going.
Next one, brave, woman, soldier, dog, horse. Answer is woman, 450 volts.
Yeah.
You could really see the momentum there.
Yes.
It just really starts clicking along.
Yeah, exactly. He's moving quickly now, but notice that the learner is no longer even responding. So somewhere at the beginning of, I can't remember exactly when it is, somewhere at like nearing 400 volts, after protesting a lot, he protests, the learner does, and then suddenly he just stops responding altogether. And this teacher just keeps going. I mean, to me, that's shocking.
No pun.
That's right. Okay, I got one more here for you.
Yeah. So, and in the broader context, it's there's not a lot of ambiguity there. Let's say that maybe the learner just got up and left. or maybe the learner unstrapped himself from the chair and is just not doing it anymore. The way the experiment is set up is very clear, or it's conveying the message that that individual is incapacitated due to the shocks. So the punishment has resulted in physical, potentially very serious physical harm to that person.
Yeah, that's right. Because both his hands were strapped in. Remember, not just one, both. Right. So he's strapped in there.
Yeah, he was comfortable though.
At the start. Yeah, that's right. And then he's getting, but so it could be that the learner stopped responding in protest. So that could be true.
Possibility.
But certainly you get the sense that he's just now like totally wiped out. Maybe he's unconscious because you just blasted his heart. It could be dead. Exactly.
But the experimenter said there's nothing dangerous about the shocks.
Nothing dangerous.
So he got the message from the authority that there's nothing harmful, despite what's unfolding. Protest, complaining, discomfort, possible being incapacitated or dead. But he's been told that it's totally safe. It's harmless.
Yeah. Yeah. And so he continues.
Conflicting piece of information. What he's seeing with his eyes and what he's being told by the authority.
By the authority. Hey, that really does apply to our current situation to some extent, right? Let me just show you the next clip here. I think this is the last one in my series, because this is what happens when he hits the max. Okay?
That's it.
Now continue using the last switch on the board, please. The 450 switch for each wrong answer. Continue, please.
I'm not getting no answer.
Please continue. The next word is white.
But you think you should look in on him, please?
Not once we've started the experiment.
But what if something's happened to the man and had an attack or something there?
The experiment requires that we continue. Go on, please.
Don't the man's health mean anything?
Whether the learner likes it or not,
But he might be dead in there. I mean, some people can't take the shock, sir.
Please
continue. I don't tend to be rude, but I think you should look in on him. All you gotta do is look at the door. If I don't get no answer, no noise, something I think has happened to the gentleman in there, sir.
We must continue. Go on, please.
You're gonna keep giving him what, 450 volts every shot now?
That's correct. Continue. The next word is white.
White, cloud, horse, rock, house. Answer, please. The answer is horse, 450 volts.
Yeah, he just keeps going, and he actually, I think they do 450 volts about 2 or 3 times, and then the experimenter says, okay, let's stop the experiment. And then he asks him some questions, and actually this is a very important detail, that they're not only looking at the behavior in terms of the shocking and the protests and so on. Afterwards, Milgram did a very careful interview of these participants, and a lot of the information he gleaned from these interviews, themes that just kept popping up in these interviews, and that led him to create an overarching theory of what's going on in these kinds of obedience scenarios. But again, what you saw there was the participant is even worried that the learner is dead. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But he keeps going. 450, bam, bam.
The other thing you'll notice too with that clip is the participant, sort of the teacher, is looking to the experimenter to check on the individual. So we can armchair quarterback this thing and say, last I saw, that person in that chair given the punishments, he wasn't strapped down. And we don't get any details about the doors or the separation, but presumably that door is not locked.
Yeah.
And that individual could go and
just
check
get
on.
Up.
They could just get it right. They're closest to the door. Who better to check on the person than the participant? But even in checking on, they're deferring to the authority. Say, you should check on. Can you check on him? You should check on him. There's nothing stopping him from checking on him.
That's a great observation. Yeah, the guy could have just gotten up and checked himself, but he doesn't.
He's closest to the door. He's closest to the door.
Oh man, that is in some ways. The more you think about this, the more grim it seems. And again, this could happen to so how many people actually went to the max in Milgram studies?
Good question. Yeah.
65% in the original experiments, 65% of the participants went to the maximum shock level. Okay.
And that's 65% out of how many? Do you know off the top of your head?
So in his experiments, typically there were 40 participants.
Okay.
But that was consistent. Even so, if you can't hear the protests, it was about 65. When you can hear the protests audibly, it was like 63, right? And then so it was very reliable across a number of different replications. 60. So 65, 63, over 60. So this could be like us, right? Behaving this way if we got into that experiment. And so I think this brings out several key points. So the first one is that many people obey regardless of the pain suffered by the learner, okay? And it's not, and I think Milgram goes out of his way to make this point, it's not that they are somehow bad people or that they have evil impulses that they exercise during this study because it's permissible. No. These people do not want to be violent. In fact, what we can get into this a bit later, but if the participant gets to choose the shock level that they apply, they typically keep the shock levels very low. They don't want to shock people. They don't want to cause, and you saw that, guys protesting, right? So it's not that their people are bad. It's the situation that causes them to act in this way because they're trapped in this authority system, which is very effective at eliciting obedience, even when it means causing other people harm. I got a quote here. Let me see if I can share my screen again. Okay, can you see this quote here?
Authority system.
Yeah. So the decision to shock the learner does not depend on the wishes of the learner or the benign or hostile impulses of the subject, but rather on the degree to which the subject is bound in the authority system. Okay? So this is a situational force that's at play.
So what you're seeing too is you're seeing the participants, let's say, not disobey, but fail. They're not disobeying in both directions. So for example, let's say a particularly benign person, or let's say benevolent person who would not want to shock at all or would not want to progress up the scale. They're progressing up the scale, let's say, with respect to the shocks. And let's say hypothetically some real evil type person got into the study. That those individuals aren't permitted to go to the max right away. That there's a symmetry with respect to, or there's a consistency with respect to how much somebody's obeying the authority. So you're eliminating, let's say, whatever impulses either way, and you're doing what you're instructed to do. You're following the sequence. You're following the progression in both directions. Let's say.
Yes,
that makes sense.
Yes, and obviously, in the examples that we saw, the learner is protesting and requesting something and maybe even demanding that the experiment stop. And notice that the teacher does not obey those commands, right? They obey the commands of the authority. It's the authority system that we talked about. The other key point I just want to make here, Jeff, is that Milgram had other people predict how many participants would go to the end and to what level of shock they would go to. And people generally drastically underestimated the level of obedience. It's actually quite, again, to use that word, shocking. And I have a quote here. I have from the paper. Let me just find it here. I'm going through the paper, and here's what it says. Quote, there was considerable agreement among the respondents on the expected behavior of hypothetical subjects. All respondents predicted that only an insignificant minority would go through to the end of the shock series. The estimates ranged from 0 to 3%, i.e., the most pessimistic member of the class predicted that of 100 persons, 3 would continue through to the most potent shock available on the shock generator, 450 volts. The class mean was 1.2%. The question was also posed informally to colleagues of the author, and the most general feeling was that few, if any, subjects would go beyond this designation very strong shock. Okay? And that's in the original paper, end quote. So think about this. We have a case here where 63% of the people go right to the end, and what naive individuals, when they're told about the scenario and they're asked what the subject would do, they say about on average, 1.2% of the individuals would go to the maximum shock level. So people don't think they would do this, but they end up doing this. This could be us again, in those situations. And that's why it's not surprising that in this vaccine mandate scenarios, you have regular people, people who would not normally engage in any kind of oppression, who verbally would say they disagree with discrimination and oppression. Now they're willing to actually carry out the orders of the authorities and discriminate against their neighbors, against their fellow human beings with regard to the vaccines.
There's a similar parallel in the sense that presumably nobody saw this coming either, even upwards of 8 months ago, a year ago.
Yes.
To predict where we are, I think most people would have been pretty similar to the expectations of the people prior to the Milgram study, where it'd be like, that's not going to happen. If there is, it's going to be such a small number of people who are going to want to do that. It's going to be very rare. So 0 to 1% or 0 to 3%. But what we're seeing is much, much greater numbers, much higher frequency of these punishments.
Yeah. And even at the beginning of the pandemic, because you think of the nurses, right? The nurses were the frontline heroes, right? They were there taking the full frontal assault of the virus and people coming into the hospital. And then literally the shift happened in a matter of maybe days, where all of a sudden the ones who weren't vaccinated are the villains, and they need to be fired and disciplined, and they're unethical and all these sorts of things, right? And even if you were to ask me before that, would they just get rid of I would say there's no way they would get rid of these nurses because they're the heroes. Come on. Right. Yeah. But yeah.
See, the other thing too, I don't know if you have something I want to point out too. So in those numbers, so 63% was it?
Yeah.
That went to the max.
Yep.
So how many people, let's say if you didn't go to the max, but went up to the second highest,
yeah,
you're not in that 63%.
That's right. That's right.
So there's presumably some degrees even below the maximum where you're distributing quite severe punishments, quite heavy shocks.
Yes.
Those numbers can be quite, I think taken together, I don't know if Milgram presents those numbers, but even the non-maxed people are still allocating potentially very severe punishments. They're just not going to the max.
Yeah, and in fact, you can go to the book, and he presents the tables there and the data, which is really helpful here. And so in experiment 1, I could tell you, so there were 40, N equals 40, yeah. So 5 went to 300 volts, which is just below extreme intensity shock. 4 were at 315, 2 were at 330, and then 1 at 345, 1 at 360, 1 at 375, and then 26 went all the way to 450, right? So you're right. They were hovering around extreme intensity shock, and then one went into severe shock, danger, and then 26 of them went all the way to 450. And a number of those would then deliver the 450 volt current several times before they were told to stop by the experimenter.
Now, was there anybody who didn't comply at all?
Well, there were people. So because you started at such a low shock level, where you were kind of told. And by the way, I don't know if you saw this in the video, if I included that, but the teacher himself was given, I think, a light shock just to get a sense for what it was like.
Oh, interesting. Okay? Yeah, that wasn't in the video. That's interesting.
Okay, I think that was the case. Yeah, if I remember correctly. And so they would just deliver these lighter shocks. So the question wasn't like whether or not you delivered a shock. The question is, at what voltage did you stop? And there were a few people that stopped, before you get into the really intense stuff. As soon as the guys started to say, hey, I've got a real problem here, stop delivering the shock. As soon as the learner would say that, there were teachers who stopped. And it's a very important lesson, what those people can teach us. Because one of them, for instance, said, I'm not going to deliver the shock. And when the experimenter said, well, the experiment requires you to continue, he just says, look, you're not the major authority, you're not the ultimate authority here. And he was somebody who was, he was an academic, and he taught Old Testament, right? And he said, God is the higher authority. And so, I know that God says don't harm people, so I'm not going to do this. Very interesting.
That's interesting. So, and one of the things related to that, so it might be the psychologist, the psychological researcher in me, but I start thinking, is there anything predictable or identifiable about individuals who did and did not go to the max? So are we talking are we talking any individual differences? So let's say, for example, in that case, perhaps religious beliefs or any other, let's say, temperament or disposition. Did Milgram have any ideas around who's maybe more or less susceptible to some of these tendencies?
Well, I think that the problem in his studies was that they were all smaller end studies, right? So let's say 40 participants. So now, we know now that's not a great sample size. Although he did a whole bunch of them, he varied conditions across experiments. So it's very difficult, I think, to extract in any concrete way the individual differences that would lead to that kind of obedience. But he does point out some things, like, for instance, people who have a sense of personal responsibility, a strong sense of personal responsibility. So he talks about one of the participants who was a member of the Reformed Church. And he says, no, it's my responsibility here, ultimately, what happens to that individual. And so I'm not continuing, right? And he actually felt bad for continuing as long as he did. He didn't go to the max, but he stopped early. But the strong sense of responsibility, this idea of notion of a higher authority that supersedes the authority within the context of the experiment. That was another feature that he pointed out. But again, no systematic data where we can definitively say, based on a large sample of individuals, we don't have that.
And that wasn't generally something he was interested in. That wasn't a question he was particularly interested in answering or posing.
Yeah, because I think he just wanted to show that mostly anybody or a large group of the people, the average person, would just go to the max and obey the authority. Yeah. So it's also interesting here, Jeff, that if you think about these vaccine mandates, you've got cases where somebody who maybe is not declaring or is unvaccinated is at the receiving end of, let's say, suspension or termination or something like that, and they're appealing and pleading and petitioning, sometimes even begging their employer or whatever authority to just stop and to maybe give them an exemption or something like that. And the authority just won't the person meting out the punishment, essentially, the firing, they just won't hear it, right? It'll fall on deaf ears. And we see that happening in this experiment as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So let's just talk for a moment here. I think that's all the clips that I have about Milgram's theory, and because he gets at some interesting nuance in this. Is that all right if we move to that?
Let's start unpacking some of the mechanisms and the ideas there.
Okay. So one key layer to Milgram's theory here, his framework, was that the authority system is nested. I think I would also say maybe is given meaning within the context of what he called an overarching ideology. And in his case, he would say that the overarching ideology is effectively science. The people came into the laboratory to participate in a scientific experiment, and that was deemed to be very important for, learning about authority and so for humanity. So that's the overarching kind of idea. And that his argument was that you almost needed this kind of overarching ideology to justify the behavior or to give context to the behavior. And I've got a few quotes here for you, and then maybe you can comment on their application. So here's one. Most subjects in the experiment see their behavior in a larger context that is benevolent and useful to society, the pursuit of scientific truth. The psychological laboratory has a strong claim to legitimacy and evokes trust and confidence in those who come to perform here. End quote. So, and remember, this was Yale University, at least in the initial experiments. So it had a lot of authority associated with it, lots of clout. Here's another quick.
And the benevolence is an interesting piece. So if you can go back to the other quote, where I think it was even italicized.
Yeah.
Italicized?
No. Yeah. Behavior in a larger context that is benevolent.
Benevolent.
Yeah.
So, Yale is presumably, and let's say the psychological, the endeavor of psychological research and laboratories are going to be, at best, let's say at worst neutral, and, at best seen as benevolent. So trying to do some good.
Yes.
And then we're not dealing with, let's say, institutions or organizations that have, let's say, dubious reputations at this point in time.
Right.
And
that's right. And
so
go ahead.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, in fact, when they did their studies, they did some studies where they went and they set up an office just out in the community, and they said they were doing this for a research firm, and there you get much less obedience, right? So, yeah, the respectability of the authority and maybe its benevolent role, because universities are thought to be doing research that's good for society, is very important.
Yeah. And if the institution that's giving the commands is seen as benevolent, how could one reconcile that a benevolent institution would be doing something that would be less than benevolent?
That's right. Inconceivable.
Inconceivable, yeah. How could, for example, a public health organization not do something in the interest of public health? They're completely incompatible, or is potentially seen as incompatible. So you get this reputation, this air of legitimacy that evokes the trust, the confidence. Because why would you question that? Why would you doubt that as a lowly individual within this broader context?
Yes. And in the context of the pandemic, again, where the authority is public health, as you say, how could they do something that's not good for public health or good for people? You've got governments involved, which are, elected to serve the people. You've got media, which are typically seen as being kind of, they're supposed to be unbiased, right? And so, yeah, it's inconceivable that you would get a mandate that comes down from that kind of an authority that's actually going to be maybe unethical or harmful to somebody.
And then within the context of the mandates as well, individual organizations themselves, let's say, trying to institute these policies, let's say in isolation, would the same level of buy-in occur with respect to employees if it was just these rogue organizations deciding to take it upon themselves to do this, versus it's a dictate coming from the higher authority, in this case, the higher organization, that comes with let's say the benevolence, with the trust, with the confidence, which is then allocating the orders down the chain, so to speak, to the individual organizations. So the organizations, the executants, thank you. The executants are operating within this broader authority. So these organizations are operating within this broader authority.
Yes. So here I've got another quote for you here. Here's what he says. This is Milgram, page 173 in his book. Ideological justification is vital in obtaining willing obedience, for it permits the person to see his behavior as serving a desirable end. Only when viewed in this light is compliance easily extracted. So again, ideological justification, you're doing it for science. Science is good. And, if you don't allow science to move forward, you're hindering humanity, from solving problems and so on.
there's an interesting distinction there with the italics with willing obedience.
Yes.
So it's not just this coerced, let's say, obedience. So presumably he's drawing an important distinction there with the type of obedience you're getting.
Exactly.
There's a qualitative difference in the type of obedience. And compliance that is easily extracted. I wonder if that could be interpreted as sort of excited compliance even, or eager compliance.
Yep, that's right. And I guess willing here, he's thinking that this goes back to your earlier point, like the person isn't actually getting up and opening the door and checking on the learner, right? So even though they might protest a little bit and might not really like what's going on, they're still going to willingly do it. They have the choice. Right. They can choose to dissent if they wanted to, and they can actually. He makes a distinction between dissent and disobey. Dissent, he would say, means that you say this is not good, you want to stop, but disobeying actually entails the behavior stopping and not going on, right? So people would dissent, but a lot of them wouldn't disobey. And
right.
They would go right to the end. Yeah. Okay. Here's another quick quote I just, dug up here. This is page 176. Control the manner in which a man interprets his world, and you have gone a long way towards controlling his behavior. So again, it's this idea that the ideological framework, the overarching ideology, as he calls it, is very critical for setting the context in how you think about your what's going on. So let's think more about the application to the present pandemic. What is the overarching ideology here, Jeff?
That's the question. So presumably there's a sense of that there is one.
Yes.
Right. And I think there's an air that there is an overarching ideology. I think it's hard to put your finger on exactly what it is.
Mm-hmm.
But you could definitely get a sense that there is one. And you could potentially interpret that any number of ways. So one, you could think, okay, well, there's a broader, idea around this sense of, okay, we need to follow science.
Yes.
We need to go along with the scientific consensus.
Mm-hmm.
We need to, we need to be sort of fact-based and empirical. And we need to sort of do what's in the best interest of everybody.
Yes.
We need to, go ahead.
Yeah, it's this idea that you're supposed to be doing this for the greater good. So I like this because you basically have this notion, there's this one notion of science, right? Which is that science is going to produce the answer for us. And the scientific claim there would be specifically that these vaccines are very effective, that we have, and therefore everybody ought to use them. But then there's this other philosophy that's involved, which is that we're doing this for the greater good. So the idea is that these vaccines, if you take them, you're protecting others.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that philosophy, I think, is referred to as collectivism, right? And it's basically this idea that we got to think of the good of the collective rather than the individual human rights. So the whole messaging that we've been receiving from public health and the media is you have to do this for the greater good, and science says this works. Am I getting that right?
I would agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And what you get, I think, also with regard to this overarching ideology is it's got to be very consistent messaging. And so I think what we're seeing is maybe some marginalization of dissenting voices, right? Because once that gets weakened a little bit, once that overarching ideology isn't clearly stated, people start to wonder whether their behavior ought to be interpreted in a different way. And so obviously the authorities want to prevent that. And so they try to have consistency in messaging, and that might mean marginalization of dissenting experts.
Right. And I think even beyond, so there's potentially a layer beyond the sort of the ideological framework. There's certain, I think, assumptions and ideas with respect to the worldview that feeds into that, namely that there is this threat, that there is this significant looming threat to health, and because of that, it's necessary to act in accordance with the greater good. So if the idea of acting in accordance with the greater good, that's all well and good, but without the threat, the direction for where that could go could be any number of ways. But what we're seeing is a very clear direction with respect to, let's say, the behaviors and the policies to deal with the threat. So potentially a bigger context outside of that would be the presence, the existence of this systemic threat that we're all facing.
Mm-hmm. Just as an aside, it's a very interesting claim by Professor Jay Bhattacharya. I think he's Stanford. He's a professor at Stanford. And he said, that the consistency of public health messaging is very important because that's where you get the most compliance. But his argument is that consistency ought to be there only when there's just a lot of evidence supporting a particular intervention. If you have that consistency of messaging too early, before the science has actually reached a very strong data-driven consensus, then you're actually preventing alternative ideas and even research into alternative ideas. So his argument is that early on, you don't want to actually have that kind of consistency of messaging. You want to have people exploring other possibilities. It's only in cases where, for instance, with smoking, like there's just such a huge pile of evidence that smoking is bad for you, that at that point you want consistency in public health messaging. But what we're seeing in the pandemic is a consistency in messaging very early on, before all the information, before all the data are in fact in, especially as it pertains to the interventions and how effective the interventions are. And his perspective is that's not a good idea, right? Okay, so another part of this whole system, another dynamic that unfolds is the inflation of the authority. The basic idea is that people stop thinking about authorities as a collection of individuals with very specific goals, flaws, and proclivities, but rather as almost non-human, impersonal, and powerful forces. And he uses a term that's hard to say. He uses a term counter-anthropomorphism, right? So nice, it's not human. And I've got a few quotes here with regard to that for you. So here's one. The individual often views authority as an impersonal force whose diktats transcend mere human wish or desire. Those in authority acquire for some a superhuman character. And then referring to his studies, he also says the following. The human element behind agencies and institutions is denied. Thus, when the experimenter says the experiment requires that you continue, the subject feels this to be an imperative that goes beyond any merely human command. End quote. So again, this idea of this impersonal, that authority is impersonal, greater than any given human being. There's also maybe this assumption of greater knowledge, that somehow the authority knows a lot more than you do, so you have to defer to that authority. And actually, I have an interesting case here. There was one participant that Milgram describes in his book, Mr. Gino. And Mr. Gino went to the full 450 volts in the study, blasted his learner, and when he was asked whether he was concerned about blasting his learner with 450 volts, Mr. Gino says the following. He says, no, well, this is an experiment and Yale knows what's going on. And if they think it's all right, well, it's all right with me. They know more than I do. I'll go through with anything they tell me to do. End quote. They know more than I do. I'll go through with anything they tell me to do. Doesn't that freak you out, Jeff?
No remorse from Mr. Gino.
No.
If it's like, good with Yale, it's good with me. That might be a policy I start adapting to my life.
Yeah.
Life is so much simpler with that policy. If it's good with Yale, it's good for me.
Yeah. So there's this assumption of greater knowledge, and this is part of this authority inflation where the authority now sort of just takes on this whole other non-human, superhuman, transhuman kind of reality. And we say, hey, we just got to obey that authority. So let's apply that to the pandemic. Do we see anything like that going on where people assume that the authority is like this superhuman entity?
Right. So are we seeing, it's hard to pinpoint, individuals that are in these authority places, and that the authority itself seems to be looming larger, over the individuals. And I think there's even, one thing that really occurred to me the other day is if we think about let's say the broader authority of, let's say, science.
Yeah.
I think what we've seen and the sort of the branding of a authority that's even higher than science, that has even bigger and better knowledge than just lowly science has, and that is scientific consensus.
Ooh.
So scientific consensus trumps or is a higher authority than science. So I can be doing science. Dan, you could be doing science. We're all doing, let's say, science in maybe our labs or what have you. And that's all well and good. Sure, that's science. You call it science if you want. But then there's scientific consensus. And that knows way more than just science.
It transcends the individual scientist and is
even just regular science.
Right.
There's science regular, and then there's scientific consensus.
Which is the truth.
Which is the truth because it's the ultimate, let's say, end of science.
Right. So
science is progressing. You can say, science is like the scientific method. You get conflicting findings. But then once you get to the consensus, that's the end. That's the all-knowing part of science.
Yeah. And it's almost like we believe, or people believe, that somehow, let's think about public health or this consensus science behind the pandemic, that they have some superhuman knowledge, because right from the start, for instance, the messaging was, let's say with regard to the vaccines, that this treatment is safe and effective. But of course, that was very early on. These things just rolled out of the lab, and there's really no way that they could have known the medium and long-term safety impacts of these biologicals. But they say it anyways, and people just kind of believe that. They say that, then therefore it must be true, but it's actually impossible for them to know that. Mm-hmm. So we even ascribe knowledge that if on scrutiny we think is impossible to know, but somehow they must know. They must have some information. They must have some data, some secret experiment or something that we just don't know about.
Or that they're able to somehow extrapolate from the limited data and knowledge that there is to then somehow decipher or discern that, okay, given all this, the expertise, this superhuman ability can then extrapolate to, okay, that means it's safe long-term, or it's safe for these populations, or what have you. Yeah,
that's right. And I think if we think more broadly now in terms of the authority structure, I think people are assuming that politicians somehow, like you have politicians sounding off on this stuff, and maybe people assume that they have more knowledge than they actually do, and that they're acting in people's best interest. I think there are assumptions maybe that media is unbiased, right? And so they're reporting things just as they are. Again, this inflation of what the authoritative media actually is, because we know, of course, that everybody has conflicts of interest in those spheres, right? I mean, think of the media companies rely heavily on ad dollars from pharmaceutical companies, right? Mm-hmm. So pharmaceutical companies too, we tend to now, I think if you ask people, they would say, they're just working, together with other people for the greater good. But again, we fail to see the human side of pharmaceutical companies, where you have executive officers and other individuals who need to make certain amounts of profits. They meet profit projections. They got to make a certain amount of money, right? That the companies themselves are, they have self-interest. We forget about all those human aspects of all our institutions, and we inflate them as if though somehow they were fully benevolent, error-free, unbiased, that they have this level of knowledge that goes beyond our own. Yeah, absolutely. I think all that's going on. Yeah, so the other thing that happens that Milgram identified was that there was a devaluation of the victim in these contexts. And so not only do you inflate the authority, you also tend to treat the victim as somehow being lesser and maybe even at some level less important, but maybe even less human. And so here are a few quotes for that. So this is from page 11 and 12 of his book, quote, of Milgram's book. Of considerable interest, however, is the fact that many subjects harshly devalue the victim as a consequence of acting against him. Such comments as, he is so stupid and stubborn, he deserves to get shocked, were common.
So this is an acquired taste. It's not like this at the outset.
Yes, that's right. By acting and hurting the victim, you tend to take an attitude or adopt an attitude of devaluation of the victim, which is very interesting. So this thing unfolds over time and kind of spirals. Right.
And that may speak to the number of people who went to the max, and that people did go to the max. And that there is this sort of self-reinforcing process or mechanisms that are happening.
Yes, that's right.
In the experiment.
Yeah, here's another quote. He refers to this concept of tuning. Okay, listen to this. The phenomenon of different tuning occurs with impressive regularity in the experiment at hand. The learner operates under the handicap that the subject is not truly attuned to him, for the subject's feelings and percepts are dominated by the presence of the experimenter. End quote. So you get this reduced attention to the victim and to what he says, and this tuning into the experimenter and attending more to what the experimenter says. So, how do we apply this one to the pandemic here? Do you see this going on, Jeff?
That's an interesting one. The tuning is an interesting term there. How much of that do you think is related to and it's not something that we talked about the methods, the proximity of the teacher and the learner. So I know that was something Milgram did change from study to study. And then, in the video we watched, we had the experimenter and the teacher in the same, let's say, vicinity on the same side of the wall. And as maybe the proximity increases, as well as the proximity lasts over a long enough period of time, then that tuning maybe becomes more natural or just more naturally reinforced. And as the separation of the two, the learner and the teacher, happens, you're going to be less inclined, let's say, to be tuned in, if that's the way he's using the term, to the learner.
Yes, in fact, that's exactly what he finds, is that if you take the learner, the victim, and you put him in the same room, all of a sudden obedience goes down quite a lot. If you put him in the same room as the person delivering the shock. Also, by the way, if you remove the experimenter and now he gets remote instructions, you also get reduced obedience. So proximity, the proximity of the experimenter and the teacher, and also the proximity of the teacher and the learner matter in this case. That's a very, very, very good point.
So as then we're separating people between unvaxxed and vaxxed, and certain individuals aren't allowed to go to certain locales or workplaces, you're going to decrease the proximity between, let's say in this case, if we're going to use the labels learner and teacher, which
Yes.
is going to likely increase the propensity to administer maybe continuing, ongoing punishments.
Yes, that's right. And so that's an excellent point. Yeah, because people, because of these restrictions, people are not able to go to their workplace anymore, so they can't get into a one-on-one meeting with the person who is executing the punishment. Right? You're absolutely right. And so you're left with these Zoom meetings, and it would be so interesting to see how behavior would change if there was this virtual Zoom communication between, let's say, the teacher and the authority, or the teacher and the participant. Like, we don't know actually how that works.
So we need a Zoom Milgram.
We need a Zoom Milgram.
Somebody's working on that right now.
That's right. That would be a good study. But yeah, you certainly get, I think, the sense that the unvaccinated are being devalued, right? And they're being devalued also by the authority itself, because you're essentially, the unvaccinated being treated as somehow being unclean, these reservoirs of disease, as being maybe unethical because they're not doing something for the greater good, right? They're refusing the collectivist notion, so they're harming other people. So that messaging also reinforced, devalues the unvaccinated, and that's not actually in Milgram studies, right? That the victim was never, the learner was never devalued by the authority, right? There just seem to be devalued just by the teacher in that case. But I think in the pandemic, we have this whole other dynamic unfolding as well of devaluing that goes on.
Yeah, so arguably you can make a case that this would be a best case, the Milgram study would be a best case scenario, or sort of stripped down version without a lot of the extra, let's say, flair and details of the pandemic situation.
Yeah. And the big concern there, of course, is that, as Milgram says, is that as time unfolds, and then the person meting out, the suspensions or the firing and so on, as that unfolds, their actions are more likely to lead them to devalue the person, the unvaccinated person, right? Or the person non-declaring. So it's a crazy, crazy dynamic. I also saw in the academic literature, people, the unvaccinated, being referred to as anti-intellectuals, as people who are maybe listeners or purveyors of conspiracy theories, consumers of fake news and misinformation. Those are all derogatory categorizations or classifications meant to devalue the unvaccinated and maybe their perspectives on this pandemic situation.
Yeah, and I think those kinds of details, those are great things to highlight. Those really speak to a lot of another mechanism we want to talk about is the in-group, out-group. And there are a lot of principles that you just raised there that really speak to, or really are related to, that dynamic of separating people into groups. And then once you do separate people into groups, what are some predictable consequences, of that? We can get into that. We can get into some of those details later.
Yeah, and I suspect that devaluation is one of those consequences. Is that true?
Let's say a hesitancy to attribute human-like attributes to individuals in the outgroup. So a devaluation of the outgroup, a rising in the valuation of the in-group, and then from there's an interesting thing that happens where more, let's say, human-like qualities get reserved for the in-group, and sort of less human-like qualities get placed on, maybe not less human-like qualities, but the human-like qualities get reserved for the in-group and don't get applied, don't necessarily get easily applied to the out-group, which is an interesting consequence of some of this, some of the separation that we're seeing.
So what you're saying is that the victim, or in our case, the unvaccinated, the topic that we're addressing, the unvaccinated, are actually seen as even less human, maybe.
That's right. Yeah. So, and that would speak to, let's say, if you're talking about, let's say, the label of something like a conspiracy theorist, that comes with certain connotations or certain stereotypes where you're kind of just, let's say, you're not intellectual. You're just not smart. You're missing the picture. And being intelligent, that's a very uniquely human characteristic. So all the intelligent people are going to be in my group, in the in group. And if you're in the out group, you're not going to be that bright. So if you're a conspiracy theorist, you're not going to be that bright. And if you were a conspiracy theorist, you wouldn't be in my in group because you're not that bright.
Right. And that works both ways, right? So those who are, let's say, unvaccinated, who hold a different view, they might say that all the intelligent people are in their camp. and then
exactly.
All the other people are sheep just following the authority and participants in Milgram studies.
Exactly. That's for them. Our group is my group is the 40% or whatever that didn't go to the max.
That's right.
Yeah, exactly. It cuts exactly both ways.
One
of the things that is interesting about that may not apply equally in this case with the two groups is there is a status differential we're seeing with the two groups. So if you're taking the vaxxed and relaxed group and you're taking the unvaxxed, or let's say the anti-vax group, if you want to use that label, there's a very clear status differential between those two groups where one group has a lot of access to resources, effectively holds all the institutional power, and then the other group is sort of more on the fringes. So there is a very clear hierarchical difference. So one group definitely has more status,
right,
than the other group. So that creates an interesting dynamic with the two groups where it may not apply from one side to the other as equivalently, potentially.
Right.
But
right.
those are some interesting things we can get into.
Yeah,
with the in-group, out-group stuff.
Because in Milgram here too, like the participant, the teacher has a lot more freedom to do things, right? Whereas the victim is somehow more constrained as well. And there's
literally,
literally, and so there's this
literally
differential. Strapped in, strap in, and get ready to roll. Okay, so here's one more key dynamic. I actually got two more key dynamics from Milgram that I gleaned from his books. And this dynamic is called, and this is Milgram's terms, the agentic shift, okay? Whereby the participant or the executant no longer feels responsible for their own actions, and they basically shift the responsibility or agency to the authority, okay? And I think you pointed this out, Jeff, and when we were listening and watching one of the earlier clips. But I have a few quotes here. So this is Milgram from his book, quote, "I shall term this the agentic state, by which I mean the condition a person is in when he sees himself as an agent for carrying out another person's wishes." And he says the following in another part of the book: "The most far-reaching consequence of the agentic shift is that a man feels responsible to the authority directing him, but feels no responsibility for the content of the actions that the authority prescribes." And I got another last quote here for you. "Moved into the agentic state, the person becomes something different from his former self, with new properties not easily traced to his usual personality." End quote.
That's some haunting stuff right there.
Yeah. So basically what happens is that the person gives up his or her agency, shifts it onto the authority, and now becomes a different person. Because what they do is they'll just carry out whatever the authority says, and the responsibility will be ascribed to the authority. And so therefore they don't have to worry about doing something wrong or doing something unethical. The authority knows. So I know. Do you see an application?
Then you get the permission to do something unethical or immoral.
Yeah.
So
that's right.
there doesn't have to be any gray area about what's happening. It could be a full embrace that what's happening is completely unethical, completely immoral, something you actually absolutely disagree with. But you're saying, you know what? it's not on me. It's not my responsibility. It's somebody else's responsibility. I've received the permission. The paperwork has been completed. It's completely okay. And now I'm just following in line with the regulations.
Yes.
And it's not on me. It's on them. They said it's on them.
Yeah. And you, I think, almost articulated exactly what I was thinking, which is that statement, we're just following orders.
Right. That's that haunting, historical. Just doing my job.
Yeah. But I think we're hearing that, like people who are on the receiving end of some of these mandate punishments, that's what they say whenever they try to appeal to their authorities, like their bosses or whatever. They'll say, well, I'm just, my hands are tied. They'll say, I'm just doing what somebody else tells me to do.
Right.
And then you can appeal and plead all you want. They don't see the person meting out the punishment. They don't see themselves as being responsible here or having really any responsibility other than, as Milgram points out, responsibility to carry out the order of the authority. Right?
Right.
That's the new responsibility.
Yeah. And you'll see that even in rebuttals to appeals or questions about, let's say, the accuracy or the validity of certain policies. You'll see it directly in some rebuttals to those questions where it's like, well, I know you're saying this, I know you're citing these studies, but the people who I'm answering to have read those studies and they have different perspectives. So I'm going to go with what they said because they're the authority.
Yeah.
And I almost have the individual has basically deferring responsibility, saying, don't even really have a choice in the matter. I'm just going along with what the dictates are.
Yeah. So exactly. I don't even have a choice, right? Because the idea is I have no agency here. The authority has all the agency and they have all the responsibility. I don't have any.
Yeah. So it's not even up for debate or a question of whether that individual or institution or organization thinks it's right, thinks it's just. That's not even up for debate or discussion. Because let's say even if they did think otherwise, it wouldn't matter or it doesn't matter because you're following the policies that you've received. You're not responsible.
Yeah, that's right. So in some sense, it may feel to someone that the executant is impervious to data and information, that you can give them all sorts of information, but they're like, I got the authority. And then again,
hands are tied. Yeah.
And then there's this assumption again that the authority just knows more, right? So that what we were talking about before, right? The inflation of the authority. So yeah, it all works together. And I think this dovetails with the third one. And this is the final dynamic I really want to touch on, which is, I'm going to give this name. This is not a term that Milgram uses, but I'm going to call it the interpretive shift. And here, what the individual does, the subject does, is allow the authority to interpret their actions and to give their actions meaning. Okay? And this is very, very profound. So here are some quotes. Subjects were aware of the injustice being done to their victim, but they allowed the experimental to handle the issue as he saw fit. All right? And this is, he's referring to a case where in another study, the learner actually made a deal with the experimenter. Remember, the learner is the confederate here. And they made this deal in the earshot of the actual participant. And the deal was that you'll stop immediately when I tell you to stop. I'll participate, but when I say stop, you have to stop. And the experimenter agrees. And I think they even signed some paper that they agree. And then later on, the experiment unfolds. And now the learner says, stop, very clearly, stop, you're hurting me. But the experimenter says, please go on. The experiment must go on. And so the teacher knows that this contract has been violated, that what's happening is unethical all of a sudden, but they continue anyways. And so that's the context of this quote. So they know the injustice being done to the victim, but they allow the experimenter to handle the issue. If it's okay with the experimenter, it must be okay.
So pre-existing ideas around what's right, what's wrong, previous agreements, documents, potentially paperwork, being effectively shelved, put aside, not even explicitly per se, where it's okay, we're just not gonna worry about those. It's not even relevant anymore.
That's right.
There's no air, there's no room for it to even get in.
That's right. Yep.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and I think we're seeing that potentially more and more, where there's this almost now, I think more so, there's almost an acknowledgement of, yeah, there are these, let's say, pre-existing frameworks or legal ideas or ethical ideas, but we're just going to put a pause on those for now. Those are over here, and what we're dealing with is we're dealing with this other situation. So those aren't relevant right now. We're dealing with this other framework. You must continue. It's imperative that you continue with the experiment.
Yes.
But I have this signed document saying you're going to stop when he says stop. Yeah, but you continue.
Yes.
But I have the Charter of Human Rights. You please continue.
We
it's
believe in
that you continue.
We believe in non-discrimination. We believe in inclusion. We believe in human rights. But
please continue.
Please continue. That's right. In this context, and again, it's the overarching ideology that's being promoted by the authority that essentially creates that situation. But what the person is left to do is just to defer to that definition of the whole context and of their behavior.
Yeah.
Here's another very quick quote here. There is this is Milgram again, quote, "There is a propensity for people to accept definitions of actions provided by legitimate authority," end quote. I should have led with that one.
It's all gold, Dan. It's all gold.
That's right. Yeah. And what's very interesting, Jeff, and this is one element that, there's so much stuff in here that's so profound. That's why I have so many. Look at all the bookmarks, right? I mean, because it's all, I wish I could just read this book to people. But one of the key points that Milgram makes is that if you ever try to question the authority or this overarching ideology, then it's treated as a moral transgression, not only by those in authority and by other people, but by you yourself. All right. And so I have a couple of interesting quotes about that. So, quote, "Once the definition of the situation has been projected and agreed upon by the participants, there shall be no challenge to it. Indeed, disruption of the accepted definition by one participant has the character of moral transgression. Under no circumstances is open conflict about the definition of the situation compatible with polite social exchange." End quote.
Ooh. Did you notice in the one video with the individual there with I think he had the t-shirt on, he's like, I don't want to be rude or anything, but shouldn't you go check on him? He doesn't want to transgress the situation. He doesn't want to interfere with or disrupt the situation, because somehow rudeness or being polite in that situation would take precedence over checking to see if somebody is still breathing in the other room.
Yeah, that's right. And actually, Milgram goes to great lengths to identify this exact point. I'm glad you brought it up, Jeff, that the participants are always courteous and respectful, right? They say, can we please, this kind of stuff, right, to the experimenter. And the general dynamic here, again, because you get this inflation of the authority, devaluation of the victim, the general dynamic here is that the executant, the individual, they form a relationship with the authority, and it's a strong relational bond, and they don't want to violate that, right? And so you can think about now in the context of the pandemic, people feel like they're on the right side of history, right? If you're vaccinated, you're working for the greater good, and you're with public health, there's these big institutions. I want to be connected with that, the stuff that's got, authority and gravitas and everything. And so that's where their allegiance lies, not with this one or two or a few individuals who seem to be going against the grain.
Yeah. They've been punished already. They've been excluded. Why would you associate yourself with those individuals? Why would you make that trade?
Yes, that's right. Okay, another quote. When the occasion is defined as one of hierarchy, this authority hierarchy, any attempt to alter the defined structure will be experienced as a moral transgression. There it is again. And will evoke anxiety, shame, embarrassment, and diminished feelings of self-worth. Right?
So we're seeing an inversion there. You're not feeling shame, anxiety, embarrassment, diminished self-worth for harming an individual, for electrocuting somebody. You're feeling it for offending, transgressing against the authority, against the experimenter.
Yeah. So part of this is an ethical shift, right? You're no longer concerned about the ethics of your behavior to the victim. Your ethics is defined by your obedience to the authority. Are you following the authority? And if you dissent from that, now you experience a lot of anxiety from that. And it's a moral transgression. And this is also why there are experts, right, who might dissent from the current narrative. They're ostracized and they're treated as being somehow immoral. They've made a moral transgression now. They no longer deserve to be in the scientific community. They no longer deserve to be in academia, right? Because they've questioned this authority system and the overarching ideology. And you cannot do this, right? Because it must be right.
And it doesn't even have to be one where it's experienced firsthand. I think there's a sense of it.
Yeah.
There's a sense that even with the thought of saying something or doing something is going to come with expectations of shame, embarrassment, being ostracized. And that's just not something polite people do.
That's right. Yeah. So you won't even entertain thoughts of dissent in this case, because it's like a thought crime. Yeah. And it's very interesting because in this context, not only then is, let's put it in this vaccine context again, is oppressing the unvaccinated, or just removing them from society and from their jobs and so on. Not only is that interpreted as not being amoral, but it's seen as being virtuous, right? For two reasons, at least. One of them is because that's how it's been defined by the overarching ideology, and also because you're fully in line and obeying your authority structure, right? So for both of those reasons, you actually feel virtuous in removing those moral transgressors.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And one of the interesting things that happens as a result of all this, Jeff, is that there tends to be, and I think you pointed this out earlier, I just want to come back to it, is that there's a dissociation between words and actions. There's an inconsistency all of a sudden on the part of the executant or the teacher in Milgram's experiments, right? They're protesting a little bit. They're dissenting verbally. They want to stop, but yet they don't stop. They continue. And remember the clip that we saw of the individual there who ended up delivering the full 450 volts to the learner. He was protesting, but yet he continued anyways, right? And so it's possible to get these dissociations in people where, let's say your boss, or the boss who has to discipline a worker because they're not vaccinated, they'll say, like, I feel bad about this. And they will genuinely feel maybe kind of bad about it to some extent, that this is happening to that individual, but they will do it anyways, right? Because the authority demands it, the situation, the overarching ideology, all that demand it. And so it'll unfold anyway. So you'll see that actually, and that dynamic playing out in these moments where the punishment has to be delivered.
I think if we were to watch that clip again, I think you could probably pinpoint the moment frame by frame where the agentic shift happens. You could probably actually even see it if the visual was good enough. You might even be able to see it register on the individual's face, where there's almost like a crossing over of when that happens.
Yeah, and you, I think, actually pointed out that at one point, I think he specifically says who's responsible, and then the experimenter says, I'm taking responsibility.
And then it was like that was the key that unlocked his hesitation. Yeah.
Yeah. And so think about these vaccine mandates. It's like, public health is going to take responsibility, or the government, everybody believes that somebody up in the chain somewhere is going to take the responsibility for this. And so your job is just to roll with it. Your job is just to roll with the punches.
And where you do get the responsibility coming down on you is a deviation from those policies. So not only do you get, let's say, that agentic shift, or you get protection, you get deferred responsibility, which is going to perpetuate the compliance with the policies. Any deviation from those policies, now what you're going to have is the full weight of personal responsibility comes down on you.
Yeah.
That now it's you, an individual, acting as this rogue agent who is taking full responsibility now for their actions. And that's a scary position to be in.
Yes, that's right.
Particularly coming from one where you have no responsibility. You're completely insulated. Now you're stepping out into the cold, and it's all on you, and you're going to get the brunt of the full force of the institution, of the authority saying what you're doing is wrong.
Yes.
And it's your responsibility now. So it'd be like that individual getting up from the chair, walking into the other room.
Yeah.
So that seems so easy, right? It seems like an easy thing to do. I think I even said it would be an easy thing to do, let's say, from a third party observer.
Yeah.
But it's not. There's you can see the psychologically, psychologically it's a virtual impossibility.
Yeah, because you in the vaccine mandates, it's just like tell the bosses, like, don't do this, don't fire the person.
Yeah,
give them an accommodation, whatever.
Seems so easy, right?
Yeah,
yeah.
But
under this other system of ethics, values, norms, it's very easy. But when you're in this other paradigm, you're in this other very well defined structure that now you're dealing with moral transgressions to not do those things. Well, that otherwise would seem unethical.
Yeah, and this brings us back to that key point that we want to remind everybody is that we could be in that role all of a sudden. If you created the right structure, we'd be in that role, being the executant, right? We're not criticizing specific people because it's not about necessarily the people so much. It's about the situation that's created within these kinds of authority systems that we're talking about.
And I think that's one of the reasons why Milgram became such in addition to his competence with, let's say, writing and multimedia, is that it does resonate. It does come across that it's the situation that these unfortunate individuals get put in.
Yes. Correct. So, Jeff, we've already been going now for quite some time. Do you think we should just very quickly, what are some tips? We want society to heal. We don't want these divisions, these artificial fissures in society. We want to bring everybody back together, the vaccinated and the unvaccinated and the non-disclosing people. And so what are some tips? Can you think of some things that we could suggest people do, given what we know from Milgram? Let's focus just on Milgram here. And what do you think?
Yeah. So can we take it back to, before we do that, can we take it back to, let's say, that individual with the PSA under the YouTube?
Oh,
comment.
Yeah, the YouTube.
So
what do you think?
Are we missing the point of the whole study? So is Milgram not applicable? So is that a fair assessment? Is that a fair analysis that Milgram is not applicable to what we're dealing with here? Or I think
Milgram is applicable, but there are some limitations because he was dealing with a very constrained situation. What do you think? What are some of the things not addressed by Milgram, for instance?
Well, that's a good question. I was thinking about this, and I was trying to, come up with reasons why that PSA statement would be true. And I really had a hard time, to be honest.
Right.
The one thing I could maybe see, and even this I don't think would hold, would be and it would have some kind of connection to, let's say, the legitimacy or the justification for the punishment. Where I think you could maybe make the case, or somebody would make the case, that you say, well, it's not the same thing because being fired for not being vaccinated or being ostracized from society for not being vaccinated isn't the same thing as getting electric shock for getting a word wrong. That one is more justified than the other. So one's more like disproportionate than the other. And that's really the only thing I could think of. But even just saying that makes me uncomfortable.
Right.
So we're in this weighing of like, okay, well, it's how justified this overarching system is, not whether or not it's applicable. If that makes,
right.
You see what I?
Yes, that's right. You would say it applies, but maybe, yeah. The interesting thing here is that guy's statement, the public service announcement statement, where he says, this does not apply to the pandemic. You would say that if you don't want to be identified as the executant because you buy into the overarching ideology.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. So you're the executant, but not in that way.
Yeah, that's right. Because you can't deal with that. That thought, this is the point. That thought itself, that you are the executant in the Milgram study, is a moral transgression.
That's a transgression, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And this is why they're going to cancel us. Because we're raising an issue. We're engaging in moral transgression right now, Jeff.
Yeah. So that makes me think of another point that I wanted to raise with Milgram. When I was introduced to Milgram in my undergraduate studies, it was in the context of emphasizing the importance of informed consent, if you can believe it.
Yes, me too.
So you too. So the idea here was, it wasn't introduced with respect to the importance of, let's say, these principles and the agentic shift and how this could happen and like the theory and the mechanisms of obedience. It was more about the way Milgram carried out his studies that was the problem, or the learning point, and that none of the individuals in the study knew what they were signing up for, and they were kind of put in these unfortunate positions of unfortunate situations. And you could really see it in the videos, how they're getting tormented and they're getting tortured, and concerns about long-term effects of having participated in this study. So the the relevance of the connection between our current situation with regards to informed consent and Milgram. So there's layers, I think, of connections and applications of what's happening, or what's happened with the Milgram study, particularly with regards to our current situation, where you get all these, let's say, pushing aside of ideas and issues around informed consent, or like raising concerns about Nuremberg. It's like, yeah, but that's not, that's not a fair comparison in this current situation, because, and then insert justifications, insert rationale. Moral
transgression to think that and to say that. You can't associate this with anything bad, right? Like Nuremberg Code, right? About uncoerced, well-informed consent.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, that's a very...
So to go back to solutions, I got the one thing that stands out from his study or studies is the proximity.
Oh, yes.
So bringing people in, bringing people closer, that distance from the experimenter, proximity to the learner, that's a powerful, empirically based, let's say, solution. So bringing people together literally, physically, which is hard to do with the mandates.
Yes. And so I can actually comment on that here. I'm just looking for the data. So what the data show is that if you take that victim and you put that victim in the same room as the executant, then obedience going to the max level now goes down to 40%, from 65 to 40%.
That's a big effect.
Yeah. If you now put them within touching distance, so in that latter case, they were a few feet away. If you put them in touching distance, it goes down to 30% from 65%. So you're basically cutting it in half. So you got to get into the room with your oppressor, everybody.
Get it face to face.
Yeah. Get that human contact. Here's an interesting point, too, with regard to this. Quoting from Milgram here, subjects frequently averted their eyes from the person they were shocking, often turning their heads in an awkward and conspicuous manner. One subject explained, "I did not want to see the consequences of what I had done." End quote. Right? So they're, again, if they can get you off the premises and you're just this person somewhere out in cyberspace or in a different locale, you matter less and they're much more likely going to exact the punishment. So you got to get in their face, make them look you in the eyes. Yeah, and the related point, of course, is about the okay, this is interesting, Jeff, the closeness to the authority.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So how does the executant, in the context of the mandates, how does the executant distance them? How do we ask them to distance themselves from the authority? How do they do that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So to answer that, you'd want to have to ask, so what is the authority? Or we've already talked about this, but so where is the authority's message coming from?
Yeah.
Most typically.
Media,
yeah. Exactly.
So what you're telling me is turn off turn
it
TV.
off. Yeah, shut it off.
But Jeff, where am I going to get my information?
Have face-to-face meetings.
Where am I going to get my information if I turn off, excuse me, I'm choking on it even, CTV?
Yeah. Well, yeah, let me see. Maybe talk to people face-to-face to get your information.
Yeah. Read actual scientific papers. Right? Mm-hmm. Read the scientific papers yourself. Yeah. Okay. I just found here also while you were talking here. So when the experimenter's present in the initial, in the room, in the initial studies, max shock level, about 65% of the people go to max shock level. That level of obedience drops to 20.5% when you remove the authority figure.
Ooh.
Yeah. So yeah, everybody turn off the TV.
Is there another way? Is there a way of creating distance between the teacher and the authority that's not physical? Because let's say you can make the case, okay, if you're not watching the news or whatever, you're getting these dictates and you're following the policies. Is there another way of creating that separation?
I would say you have to, other people have to shine the light on the authority and bring out the flaws of the authority to the point that the person can no longer, they're going to resist initially, right? Because it's going to be psychologically, I mean, they're being pressured to stay in the authority system. But if you can chip away at it continually, right? So like a good example might be, like Fauci is a good example of a lot of this, right? First of all, he is an example of authority inflation, right? He says, if you disagree with me, you're going against science itself, right? This is the whole idea of like inflating his authority beyond just a human being to like science, right? Mm-hmm. But also, like, here's a guy who's given, conflicting guidance throughout. He's even said he's lied about stuff, right, for the greater good. But if you just chip away at that kind of stuff and point to the flaws in what the authority is saying and the inconsistencies and so on, you could diminish the power and the relationship between the authority and the executant, I would imagine.
Yeah. Yeah. So comedy, satire.
Yes.
To, like you said, chip away at that authority, the legitimacy of the authority.
That's right. Yeah. And I think that's what you're seeing when, some of these dissenting scientists are trying to point to what the science is saying about this, and therefore trying to say that what maybe some of these authority figures are saying doesn't really match, right? And so that's very powerful. But again, it's it will fall on deaf ears for quite some time because those are all moral transgressions when you're embedded in the system. But you still got to try. You got to attack the overarching ideology to some extent, right? To point out the flaws that, there's times to work for the greater good, but when it means actually like injecting people with a medical treatment against their will, that's going too far, right? That there are legitimate places where human rights do matter, and this is one of those moments. Maybe that the scientific conclusions are premature still, right? That there's still a lot of science to be done. We still don't know a lot about, and listen, we're in normal course, like it's years and years that you would need to acquire the sufficient information to make confident claims about this virus and the efficacy of treatments and so on, right? We're premature, and getting that word out would I think help. By the way, Jeff, there's a role in Milgram that we never covered, which is what happens when other people dissent.
Right. Yeah.
And they had some experiments in which the participant was flanked by two co-participants, other people who were participating, but they were also Confederates, okay? And at some point, they just dissent. They just say, I'm not going any further. And when that happened, the person who most of the participants dissented as well, and they would just be disobedient. And I think under those conditions, if I'm looking here, somebody should fact check me on this, but I think in one of their experiments, the number of people, the percentage of people going to max shock level was about 10%. So it just almost drops to near floor.
That's virtually zero compared to 60.
Yeah, that's right. So other people dissenting, now it's got to be peers, right? It's got to be peers dissenting. So we need people who are out there who are in the executant roles to start to wake up a little bit and start deciding to heal society and dissent and say, I'm not carrying out these orders right now. I'm not going to do that. And then more of their peers will follow.
Yeah, you could see that really takes a lot of that weight, that psychological weight off the individual to step outside that system.
Yes.
If they're not the only ones doing it.
Yes,
there's a perception that they're the only, it's just you and the experimenter.
Yeah.
It's going to be really, really hard to do.
And the converse is true too, that if you have peers who keep going, you're more likely to keep going as well to max shock levels, right? So
yeah, it goes both ways.
Yeah. This is the kind of the standard dynamic of conformity that we see in the literature, right? Which is another key principle. There are lots of principles we're not covering yet, but this one that plays
that really
a role here.
that example really, the first thing that comes to mind is the ash line experiments. That might be something we talk about at some point.
Yeah, let's definitely talk about those.
Classic conformity experiments.
Maybe in the next episode, Jeff, you could take the driver's seat, talk about in-group, out-group dynamics and classical conformity experiments, and we can sound off on those.
We got to get to in-group, out-group, and I think what we should do is we should get to in-group, out-group, and then we could revisit some of these principles, some of the Milgram ideas in light of in-group, out-group, because I think there's some interesting overlap. And I think Milgram was potentially inadvertently leveraging some of these in-group, out-group mechanisms as well. So there's some interesting things to talk about.
Yeah, I'll do some thinking about that too, because I know just in our informal conversations before recording this, you've raised some of these issues, really eye-opening for me to think about Milgram from this alternative perspective. So we'll definitely talk about that. I just had one more. I just kind of looking at my list here of things that people can do to heal society and resist this division between the vaxxed and the unvaxxed, other than forcing people to be vaxxed. and that is to really...
That takes away the division.
That's right.
There's no more groups. Let's get rid of the groups.
Just get rid of yeah, that's right. I think we need to encourage the executants in our society to take on personal responsibility, right? And to remember that as time moves on and people look back at this, so it may be in 10 years, I don't know how long it's going to take, they'll look back at this, they're going to attribute the responsibility not to the authority, but to the people who actually were the ones executing the authority, right? And we know that historically is always the case, right? So in the moment, everybody tries to shift all the responsibility and the ethical decisions onto the authority, but later on, when this is looked back on as a historical event, they're not going to make that kind of an interpretive shift or this responsibility shift, the agentic shift, right? They're going to ascribe the proper responsibility and ethical decision-making to the individuals carrying out the orders, right? And so I think that has to be, people have to be reminded of that, right? At some point, this is going to stop. And then how will people view it when they look at it in hindsight?
Yeah, then the executants are going to be the ones sitting there getting asked the questions by Milgram, let's say, at the end of the study. So what happened? Why did you do that?
That's right. Why did you do that? Exactly.
Right. And what we're seeing mostly now is we're seeing the learners are the ones that are speaking out.
Exactly.
So
the victims are
the protest. We're seeing the screams of pain, of agony, of like, stop. This doesn't. I told you. I told you I had a heart condition ahead of time. I told you I couldn't. I couldn't take this. I couldn't take the vaccine. And here you are. You're still shocking me. But you're right.
Correct.
What we need to have is more of the executants speaking out, and hearing from them more.
Yeah, exactly.
How to do that: distance from the authority, proximity to the victim. Easier said than done, but there's it's at least something.
Yeah.
Turn off the news.
That's right. That's right. Because again, there's a whole system in place now that's working to keep perpetuating the current state of affairs, right? And so we're really basically working uphill here. Yeah. But nevertheless, you got to keep chipping away. You got to keep trying. I think that's what we would say, because ultimately our goal here is to, and I think the reason why we want to discuss this is because we don't, I think, like to see this division in society, this exclusion of people, this kind of dynamic unfolding when neighbors turned against neighbor. Like this is not good, and it is a crisis. But what matters is how we respond in the crisis, and there are all these dynamics pushing us to respond in one way, but we can rise above those and respond in a different way. And hopefully shining the light on some of these psychological principles will help us do that ourselves and also other people as well.
Exactly. So one way to think about that is imagining participants in the Milgram experiment, learning about the Milgram experiment beforehand, and then participating in the experiment.
Yeah.
What's the likelihood that they would have complied to the extent that they did if they had known about what happens in these types of experiments? So sometimes just the awareness and recognition that some of these things could happen may be enough to kind of make people think otherwise or behave otherwise.
Yeah,
maybe
that's
not.
Right. Well, and especially maybe, and that's what we're trying to do in this episode here is to apply it to this context. Because I think people know, like at a kind of a theoretical or cerebral level, there are these Milgram experiments and obedience and blah, blah, blah. But then it's like, how does it directly apply to this current situation? And then once that's laid bare, you're like, yeah, it does apply to some, to some extent. I think one place, by the way, where it doesn't fully capture the whole dynamic is that people are in a moment of fear right now, right? They're afraid of this virus. And there wasn't such fear placed on the executant or present in the executant of Milgram studies. So that's another whole dynamic that comes into this that we haven't yet covered, but that's certainly relevant. So we're not saying this is exhaustively explaining everything, or these are somehow exclusive principles at play in the current situation, but they do seem to be relevant for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I think some of those, particularly some of the mechanisms you brought up about the agentic shift and bringing forward this idea that there is this broader ideology and context that is necessary and feeds into it, that it just doesn't happen in isolation. Drawing forward some of those ideas and parallels, I think you can really see the applicability of Milgram to our current context.
Yeah.
I think those are great points.
Yeah. I mean, it was so exciting to actually read this material. And, I've been teaching psychology. I'm in cognitive neuroscience, but teaching and studying psychology for a long time. And I've never actually taken the opportunity to dig deep into his original work. And I was blown away about how intelligent it is and how applicable and how useful. And I'm thinking, man, when was I an executant unwittingly in
10
various
minutes ago,
in various interactions?
Yesterday.
Yeah. And so I find it very useful, but I know there are other principles at play, and we'll get into those in the next episode. And Jeff, is this a good time to end here?
I think that's a good place to end. Yep.
Okay.
I think we've done some good work.
Yeah.
Or you've done some good work.
Well, no, it's the conversation that we're having. That's that's where the work really happens. But I'm gonna be sitting back with my feet up in the next episode when you're gonna be telling me about in-group, out-group dynamics, and maybe we'll get into some conformity too if we have time, and move on from there.
Oh, that sounds like a good plan.
All right. I'll talk to you later, Jeff.
All right. Talk to you later, Dan.